finally, Sean Siemion, software developer, with a talk about juice in video games.
So to get started, yes, to reiterate, this is about juice in video games presented by myself. So, question everyone is probably wondering is, what is juice? So one day, I decided to try eating some unsalted pretzels because we were having fondue and we had like a bunch of unsalted pretzels left over. And let me tell you, my God, was it awful. It's like if apathy was a food, it would be an unsalted pretzel. So of course, after that, to like kind of cleanse myself, I went and got some salted pretzels to eat. And of course, they were much better than the unsalted pretzels. But why was this? Aren't they essentially the same thing? They're both pretzels, right? Yes, but one had an element that caused a strong reaction while the other did not. And I'd like to put forward that this reaction is what makes up the juice of video games. Juice is brain stimulation. That's the main point I'm trying to hammer home here. And so in order to understand this better, I've focused on kind of 6 generalized categories or like containers. And these aren't meant to be some all-encompassing truth. They're just categories I made for myself to achieve a better understanding. First is heavy juice. This is kind of what people think of when they talk about video game juice. You can barely see the slide title. That's how heavy this juice is. And really, this is big, flashy visual effects, screen shake, rapidly flashing colors, shockwaves, like anything that requires an epilepsy warning. And games that you really heavily use this sort of juice are bullet hells and shoot 'em ups. And here's one example, Nova Drift. And you can see this is a pretty juicy game. You've got lots of flashing visual effects. There's stuff happening on the screen. There's screen shake. The next category is subtle juice, and thankfully you can actually see the title of the slide this time. But this is more things that are less obtrusive. So if you have like kind of footstep sounds or swaying grass, certain uses of parallax where it's moving very slowly, so it's almost imperceptible. Games that you see this kind of juice, a lot of the time they'll use layers upon layers of effects. Hollow Knight is one example. Just walking across, there's stuff happening in the foreground with parallax. There's stuff happening in the background. They have a bunch of parallax layers. Animations, particle effects, the lighting changes. There's like a subtle lighting focus on the character itself. So it's a combination of all of these effects that make Hollow Knight a very juicy game. Next is scaling juice. This is something where the further you progress or over time, some effect increases in its extremeness. So in Peggle, when you hit the pegs, when you hit more pegs, the sound of hitting the peg goes up. Like there's like goes doot 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 doot, and then once you finish your objective of hitting the pegs, there's a bunch of flashy physical effects that happen. So one game that's a very good example of this is Vampire Survivors. It's a pretty recent game, but as you can see, there's lots of stuff happening on the screen right now. This isn't how it starts. It's actually very calm to begin with, but as you progress through the game, you have more enemies and you have more projectiles. It's all additive. I don't think there's anything that takes away the number of projectiles you get. So the game is very focused on ramping up and never ramping down throughout a session. Concrete juice. Right here I have a sprite sheet with Kirby. Everyone knows Kirby. This is a lot of sprites, right? For just this one character. It's like, you probably wouldn't think that there'd be this many, but there's actually even more. This is only a fifth of the sheet, so it keeps going. And what I'm trying to kind of say is, fully animated sprites, many different visual environments, audio variety. These all kind of make up Concrete Juice. It's like thinking about like fighting stages in fighting games, how you don't have just one stage. There's multiple stages. They might all function the same depending on what fighting game it is, but they're all visually unique. A game like FTL also kind of does this, where when you're jumping from point to point and doing fights, there's different visual backgrounds. It's not all the same space background. And I'd say this is a heavy contributor to what makes an enduring game. It's just like one of those jawbreakers that last forever. One example is Skyrim. There's just lots of visual assets where you have a lot of variety, and they also did a very good job with kind of where they placed them. Association juice. So this is like simulating people's brains with something that is enjoyable or that they're already familiar with, like food, for example. Obviously, you can't taste food in video games, but you can still put it in video games. So if you have like a spicy food or something, that's something that causes like a strong reaction because you've had experience with spicy food and you see it in the video game, and that's like, oh my gosh, is that like going to give me fire attacks, or well, what could that do? So this is like everywhere with like everything, because you can't just make like an abstract, well, you can make an abstract game with just squares and shapes. This is just a very effective method for getting people involved in your game. And you also use it in games as sort of like a macro view of a character sometimes. And a good example of this is Loop Hero, where you have very tiny sprites, but you also meet the enemies first in kind of like a little cutscene. So you get like this macro view of this vampire where he has this portrait in the bottom right. And so that view is going to stick in your mind whenever you see the smaller sprite of the vampire in the game. Finally, we have narrative juice. This is more like subjective, but this is something I believe exists because you see evidence of it with visual novels, and one of the most notable ones is Dwarf Fortress, where you have these stories that stick in your head, or things happen that stick in your head. Some games don't really need narrative juice, or they have very little, and some games have just enough. And one of those games is Hotline Miami, where Hotline Miami is a game where they could have had no story at all, or very little story, but they've used story in such a way that it adds to the game instead of taking away. All right. But juice is not. The moldy pretzel analogy. Juice is not a replacement for mechanics and gameplay. Games like kind of the original release of No Man's Sky, where it was a juicy game, but the problem was there were things missing from the game, and it was very obvious. This is the same thing with bugs. If there's lots of bugs in the game, it's like your game can be very juicy, but those are going to detract from the experience. So it's like having a moldy pretzel, and you might not know is moldy, but you would like to sell your pretzel. So what you do is you cover it in chocolate, and you sell your pretzel to people who like chocolate-covered pretzels, and they get a stomachache because there's some underlying issue with your game. Capacity for juice, oversensitization preference. So this, well, I was saying kind of like with the moldy pretzel analogy, you don't want to mistake that for just not having a preference for something. So I know some of the games I kind of prefer are more turn-based, where you have a chance to pause and take a look at the action. And so I might not prefer a first-person shooter game because you have to be very involved and be very focused on what you're doing. And you can also have, this kind of ties in with player expectations. Like if I get a visual novel game and it has like bullet hell levels of juice in it, or that kind of juice, that could be a problem if I'm expecting kind of more something a little less intense. So a lot of it comes with genre expectations. The genres that are expected to have that level of juice, they have a much higher capacity for that juice, if that makes sense. It kind of ties into oversensitization, where this is another thing I found with video games is if I keep playing the same kinds of games, after a while you just get bombarded by the juice of those kinds of games, and that could be a problem when you're trying to find other games in the genre, because then you're like, well, this is just more of the same thing, and when it may in fact be different, or there may be something else going on, but it just starts to all kind of look the same. That's the end of my talk.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much.